You have already used the HTTP service component in this training to retrieve static XML data from the server. We did this on the first day to give you a sense of how to work with data in Flex. In this video, I will start by reviewing some of the important points for working with the HTTP service component. Then we will replace the static XML file with a request for dynamically generated XML. Lastly, you will learn how to handle faults when the data is not successfully retrieved. This is the company vehicle request form that you created, laid out, styled, and populated with data in day 1. Earlier in this second day of training, you used event handling on the date chooser controls to implement the validation logic to ensure that the return date is after the pickup date. In the last exercise, you created this employees array collection instance and again used an event, but this time on the HTTP service object to listen for the return data from the server. In the result event handler, you assign the data to the employees class property, which is bound to the drop-down list control for display. In this next section, I will formally review the details of this implementation. Using the HTTP service component in the Flex framework, you can retrieve and send data using GET or POST requests to a URL over HTTP or HTTPS. In Flex 4, you create the HTTP service object in a declarations tag set, since the object is not a visual UI component. Remember that creating the object does not request the data. You use the HTTP service object's send method to retrieve the data, usually based on a user or system event. After you create the HTTP service object in the declarations block, you should assign it an instance name using the ID property so that you can uniquely reference the object. The second property you must set is URL, which references the relative or absolute address for the remote data file. The URL can reference a simple XML file stored relatively on the same file system or one stored remotely on another server. It can also access a static XML file or a dynamically built one via an application server like JSP, ColdFusion, .NET, or PHP. Back in the HTTP service implementation that you have already created, you can verify that the HTTP service object is inside of a declarations block and has an ID property set to employee service. The employee service.send method, which will actually request the data, is called from the init app function, which is the event handler for the application container's creation complete event. This means that as soon as the Flex application is initialized and created, it will request this data from the server. Note that the HTTP service URL property references this static XML file. Here is the XML data in the browser. Instead of using a static XML file, I want to use a data-driven dynamically generated XML file. For that, I will access this URL. As I mentioned in the last video, this training series will use a ColdFusion server for the server-side processing, but you could easily use PHP, Java, .NET, or other servers to do the same thing. The important point is that the server can generate the XML data on the fly and provide it to you via a URL. This page looks like a long string of text, but if I view the source in the browser, you can see that it is all XML content. Back in the main application file, I am removing the static XML file and replacing it with this dynamic XML file. The data that is returned in the HTTP service request is placed into the object's last result property. You can request that data by referencing the HTTP service object's instance name plus the last result property. In this case, that would be employeeservice.lastResult. In day 1 of this training, you populated a drop-down list control with the employeeservice.lastResult property. Specifically, you used the repeating node employees.employee to reference all of the employees. You also defined the label field property to reference the last name field of the XML data as the property to display in the control. XML data retrieved through the HTTP service object is, by default, converted into a tree of ActionScript objects. This is how we have and will continue to use it in this series. However, you can use the result format property to change the way that the data is handled in Flex. You can review these formats by accessing the Flex language reference in FlashBuilder Help. Based on your previous experience, you know that the return data is represented as an array collection instance of generic objects. You also learn that it is often more useful to handle the data with a result event rather than directly binding to the last result property. Doing so allows you to manipulate the data before you use it or assign it to a class property where it can be used more flexibly in the application. Remember that the event object is of type result_event. This class must be imported before you use it. Lastly, don't confuse the last result property with the result property of the event object. You use the last result property in data bindings directly to the return results, and you use the result property in an event handler when you pass the event object to the event handler function. Handling faults with HTTP service is very similar to handling results. A fault event will dispatch when there are problems retrieving data from a service. A fault event will also dispatch when the request timeout property is exceeded. The fault event dispatches an event object, so you will have access to properties like target, type, fault, and others. As when handling a result event, you will define a event listener function and pass the event object to it. The fault event class contains 4 string properties. The fault detail property contains extra details about the fault. The fault code property is a simple code for describing the fault. The fault string property is a text description of the fault, and the message property is a concatenation of the other 3 properties. I am modifying the URL property of the HTTP service object to reference a URL that doesn't exist. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the application displays a runtime error. I am returning to the main application code to register a fault event on the HTTP service object. When I use FlashBuilder to generate the event handler code, you can see that the new function is generated in the script block. When I save the file and run the application again, you can see that the application doesn't display the data, but it doesn't display the runtime error either. You don't actually have to do anything in the fault handler. Simply having one will prevent errors from being displayed. I am adding a breakpoint to the closing brace of the fault handler and then debugging the application. In the variables view, you can see that the event object has a fault object, and the fault object properties are listed here. Note the fault string property. I'm terminating the debugging session and returning to the Flash perspective. In the fault handler, I am calling the alert.show method and passing the event.fault.faultString property for the value that will be displayed in the alert dialog body text. I am also passing the words fault information for the dialog title. I also need to make sure that FlashBuilder did import the alert class for me. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the alert dialog appears with the fault string and the fault information header. For your next step, work through the HTTP service exercise titled Populating an Application with Data and Handling Faults.